Chapter 11. Homily was there, at the last gate, to meet them. She had tidied her hair, and smelled of coal tar soap. She looked younger, and somehow excited. "Well," she kept saying, "well," taking the bag from Arity, and helping Pod to fasten the gate. "Well, was it nice? Were you a good girl? Was the cherry tree out? Did the clock strike?" She seemed, in the dim light, to be trying to read the expression on Arity's face. "Come along now. Tea's all ready. Give me your hand." Tea was indeed ready, laid on the round table in the sitting room, with a bright fire burning in the cog-wheel. How familiar the room seemed, and homely, but suddenly, somehow strange. The firelight flickering on the wall-paper, the line which read, "It would be so charming if what, Arity always wondered. If our house were less dark, she thought, that would be charming." She looked at the homemade dips set in upturned drawing pens, which Homily had placed as candle holders among the tea things. The old teapot, a hollow oak apple, with its quill spout and wired-on handle, burnished it was now, and hard with age. There were 2 sliced chestnuts, which they would eat like toast, with butter, and a cold boiled chestnut, which Pod would cut like bread. There was a plate of hot dried currants, well plumped before the fire. There were cinnamon bread crumbs, crispy golden, and lightly dredged with sugar, and in front of each place, oh delight of delights, a single potted shrimp. Homily had put out the silver plates, the florin ones for herself and Arity, and the half-crown one for Pod. "Come along, Arity, if you've washed your hands," exclaimed Homily, taking up the teapot. "Don't dream." Arity drew up a cotton spool and sat down slowly. She watched her mother pulling on the spout of the teapot. This was always an interesting moment, the thicker end of the quill being inside the teapot. A slight pull just before pouring would draw it tightly into the hole and thus prevent a leak. If, as sometimes happened, a trace of dampness appeared about the join, it only meant a rather harder pull and a sudden gentle twist. "Well," said Homily, gingerly pouring, "tell us what you saw." "She didn't see so much," said Pod, cutting himself a slice of boiled chestnut to eat with his shrimp. "Didn't she see the overmantel?" "No," said Pod, "we never went into the morning room." "What about my blotting paper?" "I never got it," said Pod. "Now that's a nice thing," began Homily. "Maybe," said Pod, munching steadily, "but I had me feeling I had it bad." "What's that?" asked Arity. "His feeling?" "Up the back of his head, and in his fingers," said Homily. "It's a feeling your father gets when," she dropped her voice, "there's someone about." "Oh," said Arity, and seemed to shrink. "That's why I brought her along home," said Pod. "And was there anyone?" asked Homily anxiously. Pod took a mouthful of shrimp. "Must have been," he said, "but I didn't see nothing." Homily leaned across the table. "Did you have any feeling, Arity?" Arity started. "Oh," she said, "do we all have it?" Well, not in the same place, said Homily. Mine starts at the back of me ankles, and then me knees go. My mother, hers used to start just under her chin, and run right round her neck, and tied in a bow at the back, said Pod, munching. No, Pod, protested Homily. It's a fact. No need to be sarcastic. All the Bell Pools were like that. Like a collar, she said it was. Pity it didn't choke her, said Pod. Now, Pod, be fair. She had her points. Points, said Pod. She was all points. Arity moistened her lips. She glanced nervously from Pod to Homily. I didn't feel anything, she said. Well, said Homily, perhaps it was a false alarm. Oh, no, began Arity, it wasn't. And, as Homily glanced at her sharply, she faltered. I mean, if Papa felt something, perhaps, she went on. I don't have it. Well, said Homily, you're young. It'll come, all in good time. You go and stand in our kitchen, just under the chute, when Miss Driver's raking out the stove upstairs. Stand right up on a stool or something, so's you're fairly near the ceiling. It'll come with practice. After tea, when Pod had gone to his workbench, and Homily was washing up, Arity rushed to her diary. I'll just open it, she thought, trembling with haste. Anywhere. It fell open on the 9th and 10th of July. Talk of camps, but stay at home. Old Cameronian colours in Glasgow Cathedral, 1885. That's what it said for the 9th. And on the 10th the page was headed, Make hay while the sun shines. Snowdon Peak sold for £5,750. 1889. Arity tore out this last page. Turning it over, she read on the reverse side. July 11th. Make not a toil of your pleasure. Niagara passed by C.D. Graham in a cask. 1886. No, she thought, I'll choose the 10th. Make hay while the sun shines. And crossing out her last entry, Mother out of sorts, she wrote below, Dear Uncle Henry, I hope you are quite well, and the cousins are well, and Aunt Luppy. We are very well, and I am learning to borrow. Your loving niece, Arity Clock. Write a letter on the back, please. What are you doing, Arity? Called Homily from the kitchen. Writing in my diary. Oh, said Homily shortly. Anything you want, asked Arity. It'll do later, said Homily. Arity folded the letter and placed it carefully between the pages of Bryce's Tom Thumb Gazetteer of the World, and in the diary she wrote, Went borrowing, wrote to H, talked to B. After that, Arity sat for a long time staring into the fire, and thinking and thinking and thinking. Chapter 12. But it was one thing to write a letter, and quite another to find some means of getting it under the mat. Pod for several days could not be persuaded to go borrowing. He was well away on his yearly turn-out of the storerooms, mending partitions, and putting up new shelves. Arity usually enjoyed this spring sorting, when half-forgotten treasures came to light, and new uses were discovered for old borrowings. She used to love turning over the scraps of silk or lace, the odd kid gloves, the pencil stubs, the rusty razor blades, the hair pins and the needles, the dried figs, the hazelnuts, the powdery bits of chocolate, and the scarlet stubs of sealing wax. Pod, 1 year, had made her a hairbrush from a toothbrush, and Homily had made her a small pair of Turkish bloomers from 2 glove fingers for knocking about in the mornings. There were spools and spools of colored silks and cottons and small variegated balls of odd wool, pinpoints which Homily used as flour scoops, and bottle tops galore. But this year Arity banged about impatiently, and stole away whenever she dared, to stare through the grating, hoping to see the boy. She now kept the letter always with her, stuffed inside her jersey, and the edges became rubbed. Once he did run past the grating, and she saw his woolen stockings. He was making a chugging noise in his throat, like some kind of engine, and as he turned the corner he let out a piercing "Oh!" It was a train whistle, he told her afterwards, so he did not hear her call. One evening after dark she crept away and tried to open the first gate, but swing and tug as she might, she could not budge the pen. Homily, every time she swept the sitting room, would grumble about the carpet. "It may be a curtain and chair job," she would say to Pod, "but it wouldn't take you not a quarter of an hour, with your pen and name tape, to fetch me a bit of blotting paper from the desk in the morning room. Anyone would think, looking at this floor, that we lived in a toad hole." "No one could call me house proud," said Homily. "You couldn't be, not with my kind of family. But I do like," she said, "to keep nice things nice." And at last, on the 4th day, Pod gave in. He laid down his hammer, a small electric bell clapper, and said to Arity, "Come along." Arity was glad to see the morning room. The door luckily had been left ajar, and it was fascinating to stand at last in the thick pile of the carpet, gazing upwards at the shelves and pillars and towering gables of the famous overmantel. So that's where they had lived, she thought, those pleasure-loving creatures, remote and gay and self-sufficient. She imagined the overmantel women a little tweedy. Homily had described them with wasp waist and piled Edwardian hair, swinging carelessly outwards on the pilasters, lissom and laughing, gazing at themselves in the inset looking-glass, which reflected back the tobacco jars, the cut glass decanters, the book-shelves, and the plush-covered table. She imagined the overmantel men, fair they were said to be, with long moustaches and nervous, slender hands, smoking and drinking and telling their witty tales. So they had never asked Homily up there. Poor Homily, with her bony nose and never tidy hair. They would have looked at her strangely, Arity thought, with their long, half-laughing eyes, and smiled a little, and humming turned away, and they had lived only on breakfast food, on toast and egg, and tiny snips of mushroom, sausage they'd have had, and crispy bacon, and little sips of tea and coffee. Where were they now, Arity wondered? Where could such creatures go? Pod had flung his pen so it stuck into the seat of the chair, and was up the leg in a trice, leaning outwards on his tape. Then, pulling out the pen, he flung it like a javelin above his head into a fold of curtains. This is the moment, Arity thought, and felt for her precious letter. She slipped into the hall. It was darker this time, with the front door closed, and she ran across it with a beating heart. The mat was heavy, but she lifted up the corner and slid the letter under by pushing with her foot. There, she said, and looked about her. Shadows, shadows, and the ticking clock. She looked across the great plain of floor to where in the distance the stairs mounted. Another world above, she thought, world on world, and shivered slightly. Arity called Pod softly from the morning room, and she ran back in time to see him swing clear of the chair seat and pull himself upward on the name tape, level with the desk. Lightly he came down, feet apart, and she saw him, for safety's sake, twist the name tape lightly round his wrist. "I wanted you to see that," he said, a little breathless. The blotting paper, when he pushed it, floated down quite softly, riding lightly on the air, and lay at last some feet beyond the desk, pink and fresh, on the carpet's dingy pile. "You start rolling," whispered Pod. "I'll be down," and Arity went on her knees and began to roll the blotting paper until it grew too stiff for her to hold. Pod soon finished it off and lashed it with his name tape, through which he ran his hat pin, and together they carried the long cylinder as two house painters would carry a ladder under the clock and down the hall. Homily hardly thanked them when, panting a little, they dropped the bundle in the passage outside the sitting-room door. She looked alarmed. "Oh, there you are," she said. "Thank goodness. That boy's about again. I've just heard Miss Driver talking to Cramp Furl." "Oh," cried Arity, "what did she say?" And Homily glanced sharply at her and saw that she looked pale. Arity realized she should have said, "What boy?" It was too late now. "Nothing real bad," Homily went on, as though to reassure her. "It's just a boy they have upstairs. It's nothing at all. But I heard Miss Driver say that she'd take a slipper to him. See if she wouldn't, if he had the mats up once again in the hall." "The mats up in the hall?" echoed Arity. "Yes, 3 days running," she said to Cramp Furl. He'd had the mats up in the hall. She could tell, she said, by the dust and the way he'd put them back. "It was the hall part that worried me, seeing as you and your father—" "What's the matter, Arity? There's no call for that sort of face. Come on now, help me move the furniture, and we'll get down the carpet." Oh dear, thought Arity miserably, as she helped her mother empty the matchbox chest and drawers. 3 days running he's looked, and nothing there. He'll give up hope now. He'll never look again. That evening she stood for hours on a stool under the chute in their kitchen, pretending she was practicing to get a feeling, when really she was listening to Miss Driver's conversations with Cramp Furl. All she learned was that Miss Driver's feet were killing her, and that it was a pity that she hadn't given in her notice last may, and would Cramp Furl have another drop, considering there was more in the cellar than anyone would drink in her lifetime, and if they thought she was going to clean the first floor windows single-handed, they had better think again. But on the third night, just as Arity had climbed down off the stool before she overbalanced with weariness, she heard Cramp Furl say, "If you ask me, I'd say he had a ferret." And quickly Arity climbed back again, holding her breath. "A ferret!" she heard Miss Driver exclaim shrilly. "Whatever next? Where would he keep it?" "That I wouldn't like to say," said Cramp Furl, in his rumbling, earthy voice. "All I know is he was up beyond Parkin's Beck, going round all the banks, and calling like down all the rabbit holes." "Well, I never," said Miss Driver. "Where's your glass?" "Just a drop," said Cramp Furl. "That's enough. Goes to your liver. This sweet stuff not like beer, it isn't." "Yes," he went on. "When he saw me coming with a gun, he pretended to be cutting a stick, like from the hedge, but I'd seed him all right and heard him calling away, his nose down a rabbit hole. It's my belief he's got a ferret." There was a gulp, as though Cramp Furl was drinking. "Yes," he said at last, and Arity heard him set down the glass. "A ferret called Uncle Something." Arity made a sharp movement, balanced for one moment, with arms waving, and fell off the stool. There was a clatter as the stool slid sideways, banged against a chest of drawers, and rolled over. "What was that?" asked Cramp Furl. There was silence upstairs, and Arity held her breath. "I didn't hear nothing," said Miss Driver. "Yes," said Cramp Furl, "it was under the floor like, there by the stove." "That's nothing," said Miss Driver. "It's the coals falling. Often sounds like that. Scares you sometimes when you're sitting here alone. Here, pass your glass. There's only a drop left. Might as well finish the bottle." "They're drinking fine old Madeira," thought Arity, and very carefully she set the stool upright and stood quietly beside it, looking up. She could see light through the crack, occasionally flicked with shadow as one person or another moved a hand or arm. "Yes," went on Cramp Furl, returning to his story, "and when I come up with my gun, he says, all innocent like, to put me off, I shouldn't wonder any old badgers sets round here." "Artful," said Miss Driver, "the things they think of. Badgers' sets," and she gave her creaking laugh. "As a matter of fact," said Cramp Furl, "there did used to be one, but when I showed him where it was like, he didn't take no notice of it, just stood there, waiting for me to go." Cramp Furl laughed. "Two can play at that game," I thought, so I just sits meself down. And there we were, the two of us. And what happened? Well, he had to go off in the end, leaving his ferret. I waited a bit, but it never came out. I poked around a bit and whistled. Pity I never heard properly what he called it. Uncle Something, it sounded like. Arity heard the sudden scrape of a chair. "Well," said Cramp Furl, "I'd better get on now and shut up the chickens." The scullery door banged, and there was a sudden clatter overhead as Miss Driver began to rake the stove. Arity replaced the stool and stole softly into the sitting room, where she found her mother alone. Chapter 13. Homily was ironing, bending, and banging, and pushing the hair back out of her eyes. All round the room, underclothes hung airing on safety pins, which Homily used like coat hangers. "What happened?" asked Homily. "Did you fall over?" "Yes," said Arity, moving quietly into her place beside the fire. "How's the feeling coming?" "Oh, I don't know," said Arity. She clasped her knees and laid her chin on them. "Where's your knitting?" asked Homily. "I don't know what's come over you lately. Always idle. You don't feel seedy, do you?" "Oh," exclaimed Arity, "let me be." And Homily for once was silent. "It's the spring," she told herself. "Used to take me like that sometimes at her age." "I must see that boy," Arity was thinking, staring blindly into the fire. "I must hear what happened. I must hear if they're all right. I don't want us to die out. I don't want to be the last borrower. I don't want—" And here Arity dropped her face onto her knees. "To live for ever and ever like this, in the dark, under the floor." "No good getting supper," said Homily, breaking the silence. "Your father's gone borrowing to her room, and you know what that means." Arity raised her head. "No," she said, hardly listening. "What does it mean?" "That he won't be back," said Homily sharply, "for a good hour and a half. He likes it up there, gossiping with her and poking about on the dressing table. And it's safe enough once that boy's in bed. Not that there's anything we want special," she went on. "It's just these new shelves he's made. They look kind of bare, he says, and he might, he says, just pick up a little something." Arity suddenly was sitting bolt upright. A thought had struck her, leaving her breathless and a little shaky at the knees. A good hour and a half, her mother had said, and the gates would be open. "Where are you going?" asked Homily as Arity moved toward the door. "Just along to the storerooms," said Arity, shading with one hand her candle dip from the draught. "I won't be long. Now don't you untidy anything," Homily called out after her, "and be careful of that light." As Arity went down the passage she thought, "Is it true? I am going to the storerooms to find another hat pin, and if I do find a hat pin and a piece of string, there won't be any name tape. I still won't be long, because I'll have to get back before Papa, and I'm doing it for their sakes," she told herself doggedly. "And one day they'll thank me." All the same, she felt a little guilty. Artful, that's what Miss Driver would say she is. There was a hat pin, one with a bar for a top, and she tied on a piece of string, very firmly, twisting it back and forth like a figure of 8, and as a crowning inspiration she sealed it with sealing wax. The gates were open, and she left the candle in the middle of the passage, where it could come to no harm, just below the hole by the clock. The great hall, when she had climbed out into it, was dim with shadows. A single gas jet, turned low, made a pool of light beside the locked front door, and another faintly flickered on the landing halfway up the stairs. The ceiling sprang away into height and darkness, and all round was space. The night nursery, she knew, was at the end of the upstairs passage, and the boy would be in bed. Her mother had just said so. Arity had watched her father use his pen on the chair, and single stairs, in comparison, were easier. There was a kind of rhythm to it after a while, a throw, a pull, a scramble, and an upward swing. The stair rods glinted coldly, but the pile of the carpet seemed soft and warm and delicious to fall back on. On the half landing she paused to get her breath. She did not mind the semi-darkness. She lived in darkness. She was at home in it, and at a time like this it made her feel safe. On the upper landing she saw an open door and a great square of golden light, which like a barrier lay across the passage. "I've got to pass through that," Arity told herself, trying to be brave. Inside the lighted room, a voice was talking, droning on, and this mare, the voice said, was a 5-year-old which really belonged to my brother in Ireland. Not my elder brother, but my younger brother, the one who owned Stalemate and Oh My Darling. He had entered her for several point-to-points, but when I say several, I mean 3 or at least 2. Have you ever seen an Irish point-to-point? "No," said another voice, rather absent-mindedly. "That's my father." Arity realized with a start. My father talking to Great Aunt Sophie, or rather Great Aunt Sophie talking to my father. She gripped her pen with its loops of string and ran into the light and through it to the passage beyond. As she passed the open door she had a glimpse of firelight and lamplight and gleaming furniture and dark red silk brocade. Beyond the square of light the passage was dark again, and she could see, at the far end, a half-open door. "That's the day nursery," she thought. "And beyond that is the night nursery." "There are certain differences," Aunt Sophie's voice went on, "which would strike you at once. For instance," Arity liked the voice. It was comforting and steady, like the sound of the clock in the hall. And as she moved off the carpet onto the strip of polished floor beside the skirting board, she was interested to hear there were walls in Ireland instead of hedges. Here, by the skirting, she could run, and she loved running. Carpets were heavy-going, thick and clinging. They held you up. The boards were smooth and smelled of beeswax. She liked the smell. The schoolroom, when she reached it, was shrouded in dust sheets and full of junk. Here, too, a gas jet burned, turned low to a bluish flame. The floor was linoleum, rather worn, and the rugs were shabby. Under the table was a great cavern of darkness. She moved into it, feeling about, and bumped into a dusty hassock higher than her head. Coming out again into the half-light, she looked up and saw the corner cupboard with the doll's tea service, the painting above the fireplace, and the plush curtain where her father had been seen. Chair legs were everywhere, and chair seats obscured her view. She found her way among them to the door of the night nursery. And there she saw suddenly, on a shadowed plateau in the far corner, the boy in bed. She saw his great face, turned toward her on the edge of the pillow. She saw the gaslight reflected in his open eyes. She saw his hand gripping the bedclothes, holding them tightly, pressed against his mouth. She stopped moving and stood still. After a while, when she saw his fingers relax, she said softly, "Don't be frightened, it's me, Arity." He let the bedclothes slide away from his mouth and said, "Arawati?" He seemed annoyed. "Etty," she repeated gently. "Did you take the letter?" He stared at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Why did you come creeping into my room?" "I didn't come creeping," said Arity. "I even ran. Didn't you see?" He was silent, staring at her with his great, wide-open eyes. "When I brought the book," he said at last, "you'd gone. I had to go. Tea was ready. My father fetched me." He understood this. "Oh," he said, matter-of-factly, and did not reproach her. "Did you take the letter?" she asked again. "Yes," he said, "I had to go back twice. I shoved it down the badger's hole." Suddenly he threw back the bedclothes and stood up in bed, enormous in his pale flannel nightshirt. It was Arity's turn to be afraid. She half turned her eyes on his face and began backing slowly toward the door. But he did not look at her. He was feeling behind a picture on the wall. "Here it is," he said, sitting down again, and the bed creaked loudly. "But I don't want it back," exclaimed Arity, coming forward again. "You should have left it there. Why did you bring it back?" He turned it over in his fingers. "He's written on it," he said. "Oh, please," cried Arity excitedly. "Show me." She ran right up to the bed and tugged at the trailing sheet. "Then they are alive. Did you see him?" "No," he said. "The letter was there, just down the hole where I'd put it." He leaned toward her. "But he's written on it. Look." She made a quick dart and almost snatched the letter out of his great fingers, but was careful to keep out of range of his hand. She ran with it to the door of the schoolroom, where the light, though dim, was a little brighter. "It's very faint," she said, holding it close to her eyes. "What he's written it with. I wonder. It's all in capitals." She turned suddenly. "Are you sure you didn't write it?" she asked. "Of course not," he began. "I write small." But she had seen by his face that he spoke the truth and began to spell out the letters. "T-E-double-L," she said. "Tell your—" She looked up. "Your," she said. "Yes," said the boy, "your." "Tell your aunt," said Arity. "Aunt, my aunt." The boy was silent, waiting. "Aunt Luppy, oh," she exclaimed. "He says listen. This is what he says. Tell your Aunt Luppy to come home." There was silence. "Then tell her," said the boy after a moment. "But she isn't here," exclaimed Arity. "She's never been here. I don't even remember what she looked like." "Look," said the boy, staring through the door. "Someone's coming." Arity whipped round. There was no time to hide. It was Pod. borrowing bag in one hand and pen in the other. He stood in the doorway of the schoolroom. Quite still he stood, outlined against the light in the passage, his little shadow falling dimly in front of him. He had seen her. "I heard your voice," he said, and there was a dreadful quietness about the way he spoke, "just as I was coming out of her room." Arity stared back at him, stuffing the letter up her jersey. Could he see beyond her into the shadowed room? Could he see the tousled shape in bed? "Come on home," said Pod, and turned away. Chapter 14. Pod did not speak until they reached the sitting room, nor did he look at her. She had had to scramble after him as best she might. He had ignored her efforts to help him shut the gates, but once, when she tripped, he had waited until she had got up again, watching her, it seemed, almost without interest, while she brushed the dust off her knees. Supper was laid and the ironing put away, and Homily came running in from the kitchen, surprised to see them together. Pod threw down his borrowing bag. He stared at his wife. "What's the matter?" faltered Homily, looking from one to the other. "She was in the night nursery," said Pod quietly, "talking to that boy." Homily moved forward, her hands clasped tremblingly against her apron, her startled eyes flicking swiftly to and fro. "Oh no," she breathed. Pod sat down. He ran a tired hand over his eyes and forehead. His face looked heavy like a piece of dough. "Now what?" he said. Homily stood quite still, bowed over her clasped hands, and stared at Arity. "Oh, you never," she whispered. "They are frightened," Arity realized. "They are not angry at all. They are very, very frightened." She moved forward. "It's all right," she began. Homily sat down suddenly on the cotton spool. She had begun to tremble. "Oh," she said, "whatever shall we do?" She began to rock herself, very slightly to and fro. "Oh, Mother, don't," pleaded Arity. "It isn't so bad as that. It really isn't." She felt up the front of her jersey. At first she could not find the letter. It had slid round her side to the back, but at last she drew it out, very crumpled. "Look," she said, "here's a letter from Uncle Henry. I wrote to him, and the boy took the letter." "You wrote to him?" cried Homily, on a kind of suppressed shriek. "Oh," she moaned, and closed her eyes. "Whatever next? Whatever shall we do?" And she fanned herself limply with her bony hand. "Get your mother a drink of water, Arity," said Pod sharply. Arity brought it in, a sawed-off hazel shell. It had been sawed off at the pointed end, and was shaped like a brandy glass. "But whatever made you do such a thing, Arity?" said Homily more calmly, setting the empty cup down on the table. "Whatever came over you?" So Arity told them about being seen that day under the cherry tree, and how she had kept it from them not to worry them, and what the boy said about dying out, and how more than important, how imperative it had seemed to make sure the Henrys were alive. "Do understand," pleaded Arity. "Please understand. I'm trying to save the race." "The expressions she uses," said Homily to Pod, under her breath, not without pride. But Pod was not listening. "Save the race," he repeated. Grimly. "It's people like you, my girl, who do things sudden-like, with no respect for tradition, who'll finish us borrowers once for all. Don't you see what you've done?" Arity met his accusing eyes. "Yes," she said falteringly. I've got in touch with the only other ones still alive, so that," she went on bravely, "from now on we can all stick together." "All stick together," Pod repeated angrily. "Do you think Hendry's lot would ever come to live back here? Can you see your mother emigrating to a badger's set, 2 fields away, out in the open, and no hot water laid on?" "Never," cried Homily in a full, rich voice which made them both turn and look at her. "Or do you see your mother walking across 2 fields, and a garden," went on Pod, "2 fields full of crows, and cows, and horses, and what not, to take a cup of tea with your Aunt Luppy, whom she never liked much anyway?" "But wait," he said, as Arity tried to speak, "that's not the point. As far as all that goes, we are just where we was. The point," he went on, leaning forward and speaking with great solemnity, "is this: that boy knows now where we live." "Oh no," said Arity, "I never told him that. You told him," interrupted Pod, "about the kitchen pipe bursting. You told him how all our stuff got washed away to the grating." He sat back again, glaring at her. "He's only got to think," he pointed out. Arity was silent, and Pod went on. "That's a thing that has never happened before. Never in the whole long history of the borrowers. Borrowers have been seen, yes. Borrowers have been caught, maybe. But no human being has ever known where any borrower lived. We are in very grave danger, Arity, and you've put us there, and that's a fact." "Oh, Pod," whimpered Homily, "don't frighten the child." "Nay, Homily," said Pod more gently, "my poor old girl, I don't want to frighten no one, but this is serious. Suppose I said to you, pack up tonight, all our bits and pieces, where would you go?" "Not to Hendry's," cried Homily, "not there, Pod. I couldn't never share a kitchen with Luppy." "No," agreed Pod, "not to Hendry's, and don't you see for why? The boy knows about that too." "Oh," cried Homily in real dismay. "Yes," said Pod, "a couple of smart terriers or a well-trained ferret, and that'd be the end of that lot." "Oh, Pod," said Homily, and began again to tremble. The thought of living in a badger's set had been bad enough, but the thought of not having even that to go to seemed almost worse. "And I dare say I could have got it nice in the end," she said, "providing we lived quite separate." "Well, it's no good thinking of it now," said Pod. He turned to Arity. "What does your Uncle Hendry say in his letter?" "Yes," exclaimed Homily, "where's this letter?" "It doesn't say much," said Arity, passing over the paper. "It just says, 'Tell your Aunt Luppy to come home.'" "What?" exclaimed Homily sharply, looking at the letter upside down. "Come home? What can he mean?" "He means," said Pod, that Luppy must have set off to come here, and that she never arrived." "Set off to come here," repeated Homily. "But when?" "How should I know?" said Pod. "It doesn't say when," said Arity. "But," exclaimed Homily, "it might have been weeks ago." "It might," said Pod, "long enough anyway for him to want her back." "Oh," cried Homily, "all those poor little children!" "They're growing up now," said Pod. "But something must have happened to her," exclaimed Homily. "Yes," said Pod. He turned to Arity. "See what I mean, Arity, about those fields?" "Oh, Pod," said Homily, her eyes full of tears, "I don't suppose none of us'll ever see poor Luppy again." "Well, we wouldn't have anyway," said Pod. Pod said Homily soberly, "I'm frightened. Everything seems to be happening at once. What are we going to do?" "Well," said Pod, "there's nothing we can do tonight, that's certain, but have a bit of supper and a good night's rest." He rose to his feet. "Oh, Arity," wailed Homily suddenly, "you naughty wicked girl! How could you go and start all this? How could you go and talk to a human being, if only—" "I was seen," cried Arity. "I couldn't help being seen. Papa was seen. I don't think it's all as awful as you are trying to make out. I don't think human beings are all that bad." "They're bad and they're good," said Pod. "They're honest and they're artful. It's just as it takes them at the moment, and animals, if they could talk, would say the same. Steer clear of them. That's what I've always been told, no matter what they promise you. No good never really came to no one from any human being." Chapter 15. That night, while Arity lay straight and still under her cigar-box ceiling, Homily and Pod talked for hours. They talked in the sitting room. They talked in the kitchen. And later, much later, she heard them talk in their bedroom. She heard drawers shutting and opening, doors creaking, and boxes being pulled out from under beds. What are they doing? She wondered. What will happen next? Very still she lay in her soft little bed, with her familiar belongings about her, her postage stamp view of Rio Harbor, her silver pig off a charm bracelet, her turquoise ring, which sometimes, for fun, she would wear as a crown, and dearest of all, her floating ladies with the golden trumpets, tooting above their peaceful town. She did not want to lose these, she realized suddenly, lying there straight and still in bed, but to have all the other things as well, adventure and safety mixed, that's what she wanted, and that, the restless bangings and whisperings told her, is just what you couldn't do. As it happened, Homily was only fidgeting, opening drawers and shutting them, unable to be still, and she ended up, when Pod was already in bed, by deciding to curl her hair. Now Homily, Pod protested wearily, lying there in his night shirt. There's really no call for that. Who's going to see you? That's just it, exclaimed Homily, searching in a drawer for her curl rags. In times like these, no one never knows. I'm not going to be caught out, she said irritably, turning the drawer upside down and picking over the spilled contents. With me hair like this. She came to bed at last, looking spiky, like a washed-out gollywog, and Pod, with a sigh, turned over at last and closed his eyes. Homily lay for a long time staring at the oil lamp. It was the silver cap of a perfume bottle, with a tiny floating wick. She felt unwilling, for some reason, to blow it out. There were movements upstairs in the kitchen, and it was late for movements. The household should be asleep, and the lumpy curlers pressed uncomfortably against her neck. She gazed, just as Arity had done, about the familiar room, too full, she realized, with little bags and boxes and makeshift cupboards, and thought, what now? Perhaps nothing will happen after all. The child perhaps is right, and we are making a good deal of fuss about nothing very much. This boy, when all's said and done, is only a guest. Perhaps, thought Homily, he'll go away again quite soon, and that, she told herself drowsily, will be that. Later, as she realized afterwards, she must have dozed off, because it seemed she was crossing Parkin's Beck. It was night, and the wind was blowing, and the field seemed very steep. She was scrambling up it, along the ridge, by the gas pipe, sliding and falling in the wet grass. The trees, it seemed to Homily, were threshing and clashing, their branches waving and sawing against the sky. Then, as she told them many weeks later, there was a sound of splintering wood, and Homily woke up. She saw the room again, and the oil lamp flickering, but something she knew at once was different. There was a strange draught, and her mouth felt dry and full of grit. Then she looked up at the ceiling. Pod, she shrieked, clutching his shoulder. Pod rolled over and sat up. They both stared at the ceiling. The whole surface was on a steep slant, and one side of it had come right away from the wall. This was what had caused the draught, and down into the room, to within an inch of the foot of the bed, protruded a curious object, a huge bar of gray steel, with a flattened, shining edge. "It's a screwdriver," said Pod. They stared at it, fascinated, unable to move, and for a moment all was still. Then slowly the huge object swayed upward, until the sharp edge lay against the ceiling, and Homily heard a scrape on the floor above, and a sudden human gasp. "Oh, my knees!" cried Homily. "Oh, my feeling!" As with a splintering wrench, their whole roof flew off and fell down with a clatter, somewhere out of sight. Homily screamed then, but this time it was a real scream, loud and shrill and hearty. She seemed almost to settle down in her scream, with her eyes stared up, half interested, into empty lighted space. There was another ceiling, she realized, away up above them, higher it seemed, than the sky. A ham hung from it, and 2 strings of onions. Arity appeared in the doorway, scared and trembling, clutching her nightgown, and Pod slapped Homily's back. "Have done," he said. "That's enough." And Homily suddenly was quiet. A great face appeared then between them, and that distant height. It wavered above them, smiling and terrible. There was silence, and Homily sat bolt upright, her mouth open. "Is that your mother?" asked a surprised voice after a moment, and Arity from the doorway whispered, "Yes." It was the boy. Pod got out of bed and stood beside it. shivering in his nightshirt. "Come on," he said to Homily, "you can't stay there." But Homily could. She had her old nightdress on, with the patch in the back, and nothing was going to move her. A slow anger was rising up in Homily. She had been caught in her hair curlers. Pod had raised his hand to her, and she remembered that. In the general turmoil, and for once in her life, she had left the supper washing up for morning, and there it would be on the kitchen table for all the world to see. She glared at the boy. He was only a child, after all. "Put it back," she said. "Put it back at once." Her eyes flashed, and her curlers seemed to quiver. He knelt down then, but Homily did not flinch as the great face came slowly closer. She saw his underlip, pink and full, like an enormous exaggeration of Arity's, and she saw it wobble slightly. "But I've got something for you," he said. Homily's expression did not change, and Arity called out from her place in the doorway, "What is it?" The boy reached behind him, and very gingerly, careful to keep it upright, he held a wooden object above their heads. "It's this," he said, and very carefully, his tongue out, and breathing heavily, he lowered the object slowly into their hole. It was a doll's dresser, complete with plates. It had 2 drawers in it, and a cupboard below. He adjusted its position at the foot of Homily's bed. Arity ran round to see better. "Oh," she cried ecstatically, "Mother, look!" Homily threw the dresser a glance. It was dark oak, and the plates were hand-painted. And then she looked quickly away again. "Yes," she said coldly, "it's very nice." There was a short silence, which no one knew how to break. "The cupboard really opens," said the boy at last, and the great hand came down all amongst them, smelling of bath soap. Arity flattened herself against the wall, and Pod exclaimed, nervous, "Now then." "Yes," agreed Homily after a moment, "I see it does." Pod drew a long breath, a sigh of relief, as the hand went back. "There, Homily," he said placatingly, "you've always wanted something like that." "Yes," said Homily. She still sat bolt upright, her hands clasped in her lap. "Thank you very much. And now," she went on coldly, "will you please put back the roof?" "Wait a minute," pleaded the boy. Again he reached behind him. Again the hand came down, and there beside the dresser, where there was barely room for it, was a very small doll's chair. It was a Victorian chair, upholstered in red velvet. "Oh," Arity exclaimed again, and Pod said shyly, "Just about fit me, that would." "Try it," begged the boy, and Pod threw him a nervous glance. "Go on," said Arity, and Pod sat down in his nightshirt, his bare feet showing. "That's nice," he said after a moment. "It would go by the fire in the sitting-room," cried Arity. "It would look lovely on red blotting paper." "Let's try it," said the boy, and the hand came down again. Pod sprang up, just in time to steady the dresser, as the red velvet chair was whisked away above his head, and placed presumably in the next room but one. Arity ran out of the door and along the passage to see. "Oh," she called out to her parents, "come and see. It's lovely." But Pod and Homily did not move. The boy was leaning over them, breathing hard, and they could see the middle buttons of his night shirt. He seemed to be examining the farther room. "What do you keep in that mustard pot?" he asked. "Coal," said Arity's voice, "and I helped to borrow this new carpet. Here's the watch I told you about, and the pictures." "I could get you some better stamps than those," the boy said. "I've got some Jubilee ones with the Taj Mahal." "Look," cried Arity's voice again, and Pod took Homily's hand. "These are my books." Homily clutched Pod as the great hand came down once more in the direction of Arity. "Quiet," he whispered. "Sit still." The boy, it seemed, was touching the books. "What are they called?" he asked, and Arity reeled off the names. "Pod," whispered Homily, "I'm going to scream." "No," whispered Pod, "you mustn't, not again." "I feel it coming on," said Homily. Pod looked worried. "Hold your breath," he said, "and count 10. The boy was saying to Arity, "Why couldn't you read me those?" "Well, I could," said Arity, "but I'd rather read something new." "But you never come," complained the boy. "I know," said Arity, "but I will." "Pod," whispered Homily, "did you hear that? Did you hear what she said?" "Yes, yes," Pod whispered, "keep quiet." "Do you want to see the storerooms?" Arity suggested. Next, and Homily clapped a hand to her mouth, as though to stifle a cry. Pod looked up at the boy. "Hey," he called, trying to attract his attention. The boy looked down. "Put the roof back now," Pod begged him, trying to sound matter-of-fact and reasonable. "We're getting cold." "All right," agreed the boy, but he seemed to hesitate. He reached across them for the piece of board which formed their roof. "Shall I nail you down?" he asked, and they saw him pick up the hammer. It swayed above them, very dangerous looking. "Of course, nail us down," said Pod irritably. "I mean," said the boy, "I've got some more things upstairs." Pod looked uncertain, and Homily nudged him. "Ask him," she whispered, "what kind of things?" "What kind of things?" asked Pod. "Things from an old doll's house there is on the top shelf of the cupboard, by the fireplace, in the schoolroom." "I've never seen no doll's house," said Pod. "Well, it's in the cupboard," said the boy, "right up by the ceiling. You can't see it. You've got to climb on the lower shelves to get to it." "What sort of things are there in the doll's house?" asked Arity, from the sitting room. "Oh, everything," the boy told her. "Carpets and rugs, and beds with mattresses, and there's a bird in a cage, not a real one, of course, and cooking pans and tables, and 5 gilt chairs, and a pot with a palm in it, a dish of plaster tarts, and an imitation leg of mutton." Homily leaned across to Pod. "Tell him to nail us down, lightly," she whispered. Pod stared at her, and she nodded vigorously, clasping her hands. Pod turned to the boy. "All right," he said, "you nail us down, but lightly, if you see what I mean. Just a tap or two here and there.